All right, hello. Can everybody hear me? All right, thank you for coming in the midst of lunch. So appreciate that. We have a wonderful panel on deconstruction state violence. We have Sora Han, who's in Department of Criminology at UC Irvine, Andrea Smith in the Department of Media Studies at UC Riverside, and Denise DaSilva in the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC San Diego. And up first is Sora Han.
Yes, thank you all for being here during lunchtime. We barely have time to nourish ourselves in these busy activities for today. I just want to preface my comments in terms of, I guess, a history between myself, Andy, and Denise, and this ongoing conversation we've been having in multiple forms across the UC system. And really trying to sort of think about this sphere of violence, and in particular our panel, state violence, and the kinds of complex analytics that particular object of study requires us to develop. And I think intersectionality is a point of departure and a point of return for us in our sort of ongoing conversation about how to formulate responses given the kinds of cultural forms that inhabit this space of state violence. And I also want to preface my comments with, definitely I'm in the Department of Criminology, which is actually a very new kind of discourse that I'm engaging in, and that originally, actually, I did my legal training here at UCLA, and at the time it definitely would not have been sort of imaginable to me that I would have ended up in a criminology department, but for what it's worth, that's where I am. And so my talk today is sort of a presentation based on some of the things that I've been learning about this discipline in the couple years that I've been in this department. And so the title of my talk today is called From Mapping to Punishing the Margins. Few in criminology would disagree that the current post-racial era uses the racial language of criminal justice and punishment as the central issue for political mobilization. From the war on drugs to the war on terror, the racial specter of crime has fueled countless laws comprising the infrastructure of mass incarceration. The premier scholars of punishment of our time, from David Garland to Pat Carlin, Jonathan Simon to Michelle Brown, all find common ground in the difficult reality that if we're to fundamentally change mass incarceration as a political movement to roll back the rehabilitative ideal, that is, if we want to do more than engage the endless work of reform, we must insist on a serious study of the relationship between culture and politics. And so this is a very, visible kind of, I wouldn't say trend, but this is where many of the scholars who look at the history of punishment have sort of ended up. To aim beyond reform has always been the reason why we've studied culture. And while the study of culture was never easy, despite the mid-20th century cultural turn taken in virtually all disciplines, it never entirely disappeared from the more instrumentalist-oriented disciplines like criminology, like law or public policy, etc. All of this in the wake of political backlashes during the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton years against feminism, against anti-racism, against socialism, against environmentalism. The urgency of studying culture still bears its mark on our institutions and disciplines, even if they appear more like arcane ruins than explicit research agendas. Thus, although it's the general tendency now, especially given the financial crises that purportedly necessitate slashing public funding for education and the humanities more specifically, to become even more instrumental in our responses to all the images and stories of political lack, I'd like to suggest that such conditions actually necessitate the opposite response, That is, we need less empiricism and more synthesis, less rearticulation and more creation, less schematics and more rhetoric, less information and more dissemination. And specifically with respect to the legal theory of intersectionality, this means that we would need to ask towards what end the analytical mode of mapping the margins has been put to use since its writing. For what makes our political situation more insidious still is that many of the civil rights gains of the movements, the women's and anti-racist movements, have been twisted by the neoliberal state into what feminist criminologist Nita Chesney-Lind has called vengeful equity. Women in prison experience all kinds of harsh punishment, viewed before the law as equal counterparts to men and in direct violation of international human rights norms and conventions. Mandatory arrest laws for police responding to domestic violence have skyrocketed rates of women's incarceration and given fodder to the argument that women are equally violent as men in disposition. Gender-responsive prisons as a development in response to the liberal difference argument, aside from relying on traditional notions of proper womanhood in order to carve out these special types of confinement, further expand the horizon of prison building, bureaucratic punishment, and biopolitical control. This is a sad, sad state of legal affairs. Failures, one written all over the feminist criminological literature. Our critiques of the state's failures to protect women from violence have been convoluted by the hegemony of formal equality into policies that have actually proliferated types and scales of state violence against women. So perhaps if there's anything redeeming about criminology, it's this particular feminist confession. To address the recent writings in feminist criminology would require not only a recognition of this confession, which I think is a productive place to start, but as well this sort of curious simultaneous adoption of the language of intersectionality. And this is a very explicit sort of vernacular inaugurating the flagship journal called Feminist Criminology. In the introduction to the first issue of this journal in 2006, Amanda Burgess Proctor proclaimed that this body of knowledge from which the journal inherited its name would only realize its full potential by an embrace by criminologists of intersectionality, and in other places named race, class, gender analysis. And feminist criminologists have written a number of articles about this race, class, gender analysis. Indeed, a very curious yoking of feminist criminology with intersectionality specifically is developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, which I think is worth interrogating. So several questions come to mind in regards to this confession and sort of reconciliatory gesture. Does the race, class, gender analysis signified by intersectionality contain the possibilities of reorganizing a feminist effort against increased and proliferating forms of state violence against women that feminist criminology invests it with? What does and should it mean that the future of feminist criminology lies in its willingness to embrace intersectionality? And can intersectionality adequately contain and generate the specific kinds of analyses feminist criminology gestures towards? What exactly does this mean, not only in how we study violence against and the criminalization of women, but as well how we formulate thoroughgoing political responses to these processes? We'll recall that the central schematic developed in this framework of intersectionality is the unique phenomenon of violence against women of color, privatized and publicized forms of intimate violence, the insufferability of the victims of this violence, the inadequate responses of mainstream feminist legal reforms to address these violences, the uneven racialization of women and men of color in these scenes of violence, and generally, the racist justice, the media conspiracies, and police brutality at the heart of the state's ever-growing surveillance of communities of color, women, children, and men alike, albeit in varying ways. Beth Ritchie, Andrea Smith, Dorothy Roberts, Angela Harris, Margot Okazawa-Ray, Julia Severin. The list could go on in terms of a wider community of scholars writing about sexual violence and who've demonstrated for as long as these mainstream feminist reforms have been underway the strategy of criminalizing sexual violence is just yet another way of demonizing racial poverty. So in a certain way, feminist criminology's investment in intersectionality is understandable. From this specific vantage point of this backlash against feminist reforms that feminist criminology is now wanting to address, revisiting the theory of intersectionality reads almost like a big sort of "I told you so," right? As this unheeded omen issued 2 decades ago about this perverse future in which we currently live, a perversity which became visible through an intersectional analysis. By mapping the margins, we should have benefited from a very logical and historically grounded argument that that only investing directly in the social and cultural well-being of minority communities, right, not investment in state agencies or established political organizations or commodified popular culture, that only investing directly in minority communities that we would sort of be able to address the forms of violence against women of color made object of that, of Crenshaw's article. But does feminist criminology's retrospective adoption of this mapping as a methodology promise to undo what the mapping in the first place was designed to prevent? My short answer is maybe if. Although intersectionality might be one place to start in thinking ourselves out from under the backlash, it certainly cannot be done without factoring in the kinds of shifts in culture all theory, even intersectionality, tries to get a hold of long enough to be able to say something about the present for the future. And I've written elsewhere about intersectionality, how we might rescue readings of intersectionality that generally tend to reinscribe identity politics from dominant identity politics, which we'll recall is the politics intersectionality is a theoretical critique of, to coalitional or multiculturalist identity politics, which is for the most part how feminist criminology understands intersectionality. However, despite the fact that I'm sympathetic towards defending intersectionality against certain critics invested in displacing the radical tradition of women of color thinking around these issues, I also think that intersectionality cannot be where feminist criminology's political aspirations end if it truly wants to understand and fight back against state violence. For intersectionality is a very specific and now I would say somewhat reified and such that sort of contesting the complexities of neoliberal structural adjustments, bureaucratic rationalities, and professionalizing knowledge formations, and most troubling, the racial imaginary of punishment as that thing which underwrites mass incarceration. To be clear, this narrowness, by which I mean the sort of legal aspect of intersectionality and the reified nature of the framework in this sort of race, class, gender analysis that it oftentimes is sort of reduced to, has less to do with the kinds of histories, experiences, and social contexts the theory deals with and takes as its motivating concern. Rather, it's because the theory assumes that the law is extra-linguistic. It fails to centralize how the language of the law and legal reform is part of, not outside of culture's representations and imaginaries. In short, it doesn't centralize the problem of culture, but makes it one arena among others that is like political and social institutions that are regulatable by law. This, despite the fact that it's clear when one goes back to the cases upon which intersectionality is thought, the inability for the law to redress black women or women of color is precisely a problem of the law's language. So if the legal narrowness and reified form of intersectionality is to be unthought today, one would need to actually lift intersectionality from the race, class, gender framework and read it more accurately or more literally as an implicit critique of the law's language. Read it, to put it another way, not for the obvious substantive meanings it tries to convey about racism and misogyny, but rather for the obtuse meaning it gropes towards, those absences, the figure of women of color serving as a holding place for the blank spaces that the law needs to say or do anything. Thus, because the political problem of the law's language is only implicit, not only has this given way to grossly empirical applications of the theory, it also builds in a theoretical blind spot. And so what I mean by grossly empirical applications, in criminology you'll see the sort of really routinized sort of production of studies based on identity categories, and by virtue of studying, women of color, right, that particular identity, there's this way in which criminology feels that it's expanding and sort of finding alternative spaces in which we can really contest state violence. So that's what I mean by these empirical applications. And those are sort of enabled by the fact that intersectionality has this kind of theoretical blind spot with respect to law's language. The theory could not foresee how the state would double down such failure and omission, not for more robust multiracial feminist-informed social welfare programming, but for an unprecedented and stubbornly accommodating racial project, right, the racial project of mass incarceration. The theory could not explicitly warn against how colorblindness would be the medium through which any and all politics thirsting to get tough on crime would become our state of racial warehousing. And Kristen Buehmiller makes this very clear in her book, In an Abusive State, which is an excellent study of the domestic violent movement's racist alliance with the state, that it was the hegemony of neoliberalism that expanded the state's regulatory powers into the sphere of population control and private intimacies, and in ways that intersectionality has not been able to articulate beyond the kinds of exclusion and identity-based reforms its race, class, gender analysis attends to. This is not to say that intersectionality cannot attend to the dynamics of hyperreality that Baudrillard has so convincingly shown to be our cultural condition, but only that if we're to do this, by those who are now taking it up, like feminist criminologists, it would have to draw on a whole host of cultural theories and strategies that for the most part have been either abandoned or dismissed, except by a select few. If it doesn't pick up in a way where it began, that is, with an engagement with the language of the law, the mapping that intersectionality endorses becomes highly problematic. For in the hyperreal cultural condition of our times, and political scientist Diane Rubenstein has written about this, right? The territory no longer precedes the map but is generated by it. Right? There's not this territory out there. There's not this reality that we need to map as people engage in knowledge production, but that our mappings actually produce these territories, right? If intersectionality is not returned to its narrow beginnings, it contains the danger of producing territories of study for disciplines like criminology that unabashedly prioritize improving and expanding the labors of the state to control us, our lives, our desires, and our futures. No surprise then that feminist criminology would, in a very curious gesture, embrace intersectionality for mapping purportedly new territory it would lay claim to, as if no one already inhabits it, as if it's not already known, indeed something that we might call a feminist epistemological manifest destiny. Thus, more than ever, and these are just my concluding remarks, I would just like to say that, in sort of revisiting intersectionality, we need to be more vigilant in demanding complex, nuanced, and imaginative approaches to studying the law, which intersectionality once was and still is, but only if we read it otherwise. For as a legal concept, it's more specific than is generally acknowledged by those who have and would import it into their various disciplines and interdisciplines, but also because as a legal concept, it flattens a genealogy of which it's part and not representative of. This demand, let me end, must at sort of every step of the way, and I think that these steps are very concrete, especially in the ways that the University of California in particular, is being forced to do in response to the financial crisis, right? That our demands must include reforms that create spaces for studying the cultural force of disciplines and technical languages that through their various modes of mapping produce ever-expanding forms of state violence and that produce the same as the like. Thank you.
Hello. I would like to thank the Tongva peoples on whose land we stand and also the organizers for this conference. And before I begin, I have to give a little plug for another conference at UC Riverside next March. It's Critical Ethnic Studies in the Future of Debt, Genocide, Settler Colonialism, Heteropatriarchy, and White Supremacy. We have many great speakers: Jackie Alexander, Angela Davis, Kathy Cohen, Judith Halberstam, Ruthie Gilmore, Gayatri Gopinath, Manning Marable. And UC Riverside is the home of the fun and the smart revolution. So we also will have a trip to the day spa integrated and a dance party. So you don't want to miss this, and we have a call for papers, so be sure to pick one up. So today I'm kind of reworking an older thing on hate crimes, but there would be no reason why anybody would know that particular article, so I kind of have to restate it, but also as an opportunity to look at questions that have been produced from me thinking about the issue of hate crimes. So to begin, to kind of set this story up, when I was at UC Santa Cruz in a graduate school, I organized a forum for Native women in prison. And I sent out a little blurb on supposedly the progressive listserv, and I basically got this kind of hate mail from a white student who threatened to beat me up basically if I ever sent him any more emails. So I got kind of freaked out and just happened to send it out to people saying, whoa, look what I got. Anyway, before I know it, I was flooded with emails from people saying, you need to take this dude out, let's go organize against him. One person thought I was that person and called me up to yell at me. I'm like, no, I was the one who got the email, I didn't send it out. Anyway, but anyway, what struck me though was with this flurry of emails I got is that the year before I had sent an email to these same listservs letting them know that we had met with the dean, who said that he would not hire anybody in Native Studies because he said Native Studies is a squandering of resources. But when I sent an email about that, there was no response at all. Nobody wanted to organize. It was complete, total silence. It seemed like almost indifference. So the question that came up to me, what was it about this speech that provoked this strong reaction from a student who actually had relatively little power to do anything to us, whereas the dean, who had the ability to shut down Native Studies altogether, produced no response at all. So to me, this is symptomatic of the kind of the politics of hate crime organizing in the U.S. as a whole. A strategy that's taken by organizers against racialized and gender terror is to articulate this terror as a crime, as a hate crime. And publicizing of a hate crime can mobilize even relatively complacent citizens to fight the hate. And of course, we're seeing this going on with UC San Diego as we speak, so it's a timely situation happening. So in this article, I want to assess some of the political effects of hate crime organizing and argue that when organizing against racial and or gender terror adopts the strategy of making this terror, quote, a crime, it actually serves to reproduce the patriarchy and white supremacy of the state by masking the racism within capitalism and the nation state itself. And so by doing so, I want to look at the phrase hate crime by looking at first crime and then hate. So the development of the hate crimes movement began as kind of a confluence between identity-based racial and other social justice movements with the crime victims movements. Racial and gender justice groups focused on violence as one aspect of racial and gender oppression, and meanwhile the crime victims movement, which in actually many respects supported a repressive anti-crime agenda that would be at odds with racial justice organizing, articulated crime victims as an oppressed group with rights. So the confluence of these movements then served to highlight victims of racial or gender hate crimes as people deserving of particular legal rights. And it would also seem that what's going on at the same time is that as more radical racial and social justice organizations were either crushed or co-opted by the U.S. government, these movements shifted from focusing on radically restructuring the political and economic system we are in to focus on articulating identity-based claims that did not necessarily challenge the prevailing power structure. So if groups were not going to directly challenge the state, they could then call on the state to recognize their claims to equality and redress from harms perpetrated by other social actors. So the term hate crimes then emerged in 1885 with the House of Representatives sponsored bill, the Hate Crimes Statistics Act. So then ironically then, the same U.S. government which codified slavery, segregation, anti-immigrant racism, and the genocide of indigenous peoples now became the body that will protect people of color from racial terror. And in fact, the Southern Poverty Law Center announced that it had begun a cooperative relationship with the state by collaborating with the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center to train law enforcement officers to recognize and respond to hate crimes. And the defining of race hate as a crime appears to mirror the strategy by the anti-violence movement, which defined violence against women as a crime. Thus, race and gender hatred is supposed to be against the law, thereby permitting the state to intervene and protect women and people of color against those who would perpetrate race and gender hate crimes. But the question then arises, what are we to do about the fact that, as Native scholar Lawana Ross notes, genocide has never been against the law in the United States? And on the contrary, genocide has been explicitly sanctioned as the law. So as Beth Ritchie notes, the co-optation of the anti-violence movement really can be traced to when we decided to organize around mobilizing and articulating this violence as a crime. As I've argued in other works, gender violence is actually here because of the state. I mean, if we look at the history of Indian genocide, violence in Native communities is largely the result of boarding school policies, Indian massacres, etc. But now, for some reason, the state is going to be the solution to the problems it has created in the first place. However, what has happened since as the anti-violence movement has developed is that rape crisis centers and domestic violence programs have worked on promoting the criminal justice system and strengthening it by calling for longer prison sentences, more police involvement, etc. And in fact, many anti-violence programs are actually located in police departments, effectively operating as arms of the state. For instance, there was one domestic violence shelter in South Dakota that was conducting background searches on their clients and having them arrested if they had any outstanding warrants, even though the crimes that they were being held for were actually as a result of domestic violence, where their partner was involved in the drug trade and they were being arrested for being, quote, abetting in these crimes. And so then in doing this, the approach to criminalization has not actually led to any less violence against women. And here I'm going to assume you already know about the prison industrial complex and why it's evil and doesn't do anything to solve the problem of crime. But unfortunately, the remedies that have been pursued by the mainstream anti-violence movement have strengthened rather than undercut state violence. And by this, I'm not necessarily saying again that the prisons are currently populated by batterers and rapists, but rather it has become very easy for the state to co-opt feminist rhetoric to support a repressive anti-crime agenda. For instance, the Violence Against Women Act was attached to the Repressive Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which increased the use of the death penalty, added over 50 federal offenses, many of which criminalized youth of color in particular, eliminated Pell Grants for prisoners, and expanded the prison industrial complex by $9.7 billion. But this was heralded as, quote, feminist legislation. So essentially, the adoption of hate crimes as a strategy for addressing racial and gender justice has shifted our analysis from articulating the state as constituted by heteropatriarchy and white supremacy to uncritically upholding the liberal multicultural state as the institution that recognizes and legitimizes legal and political claims based on gender and race. And as Elizabeth Pavanelli has demonstrated, the liberal state depends on a politics of multicultural recognition that, quote, includes social difference without social consequences. The state, rather than being understood as defined through gender and racial subordination, becomes positioned as the body to recognize and protect racial and gender difference. But because the state actually has no interest in racial and gender justice, many of the laws that we use to get passed end up being used against us. For instance, if we look at the mandatory arrest laws now around domestic violence, batterers now get smart and call the police first. And as Beth Ritchie's work notes in her work on in Chicago jails, that there's an alarming number of women who are there on domestic violence charges simply because the batterers called the police first. And back to Chicago, when I was organizing there in 1991, what the Chicago Police Department informed us that the majority of people who are arrested on hate crimes are people of color for committing hate crimes against white people. So this is who we were protecting. And the New York Times did a study that found the net result of all these legislation that we got passed has resulted in a situation in which battered women are killing their partners less often, but batterers are not killing their partners less often. So we basically have created safety for batterers. So Timothy Kaufman Osborne, in his study on the connections between lynching and the death penalty, explores how the death penalty both continues and supersedes lynching, in that it allows the state to reproduce white supremacy while disavowing that reproduction by allowing racism to be perpetrated under the cover of law and bureaucracy. Quote, "The practices constitutive of due process are a pretense, not in the sense that they render capital punishment and lynching identical, but rather in the more subtle sense that they mask the continued articulation of the racial contract within a polity that no longer openly espouses the rhetoric of white supremacy." And he mirrors Philip Deloria's analysis of the institutionalization of anti-Indian racism in the U.S., and he argues that while the state's investment in native colonization in the 1900s did not end, the state did seek to ensure that the sole executor of colonialism would be the state. Consequently, it began to condemn the massacres conducted by settlers acting independently from the purview of the state in order to ensure the omnipresence of the law. Thus, in both cases, we see, as Foucault notes, genocide and white supremacy become routinized through the law, while at the same time the regime of the law is perfected over white people as well. So that is, while white supremacy is to be maintained by the state, it is equally important to ensure that it is maintained through the state rather than whites acting outside the law. Thus, by extending Kaufman, Osborne, and Deloria's analysis, we can look at hate crimes as the strategy by which the state reserves the right to perpetrate hate crimes to itself. So now I will move on to hate. So when we look at the word hate, we tend to think of individuals who hate. We don't tend to think of institutions or the state as something that hates. So when one's analysis focuses on institutionalized white supremacy, such as the prison industrial complex or the occupation of indigenous lands, we don't think so much about hatred, but we see a normalized set of relations that maintains a racialized and gendered economic and political system that benefits the few at the expense of many. This daily racism then becomes contrasted to race hate. That is, race hate seems to be a more extreme version of the everyday racism and sexism we live under. So as mentioned in the story as I mentioned in the beginning of this talk with that story, it was the hate speech of the student which makes the speech of the academic dean seem insignificant. In fact, institutions that benefit from white supremacy can now be called upon to stop hate crimes. So while not wishing to minimize the trauma of hate crimes, it is certainly the case that if we look at Ruthie Gilmore's definition of racism as, quote, state-sanctioned and or legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death, unquote, the daily practices embedded in institutions of white supremacy cause much more premature death than do individual hate crimes. George Bush's attack on Iraq is generally not articulated as a hate crime, and in fact, Bush contrasted the two when he began advocating for the aggressive prosecution of hate crimes against Arab Americans while simultaneously launching the war on terror against Arab countries. Quote, "While our brave soldiers are fighting aggression overseas, a few hate mongers here at home are perpetrating their own brand of cowardly aggression. These hate crimes have no place in a free society, and we are not going to stand for them." So the former, acts of violence committed against individual Arab Americans, qualify as hate crimes, while the latter, killing thousands of Arab peoples through military invasion, is normalized as foreign policy. So to illustrate, a magazine ran a photo essay on the Ku Klux Klan, and as one of its captions, it noted there are no hate groups in South Dakota. This will be of considerable interest to the indigenous nations in South Dakota, who have seen no shortage of hate directed at them by the state and its white residents. So, for example, this following statement was made at a 1990 zoning hearing, which called for the denial of a permit for an Indian battered women's shelter in South Dakota. Quote, Indian culture, as I view it, is so mongrelized as to be a mix of dependency on the federal government and a primitive society wholly on the outside of mainstream of Western civilization and thought. The Native American culture is a culture of hopelessness, godlessness, of joblessness, and lawlessness. Alcoholism, social disease, child abuse, and poverty are the hallmarks of the so-called culture that you seek to promote. I think that the Indian way of life, as you call it, is cigarette burns in the arms of children, double-checking the locks on my cars, keeping a loaded shotgun by my door, and car bodies and beer cans on the front lawn. This is not a matter of race. It is a matter of keeping our community and neighborhood away from the evil that you and your ideas promote. And this testimony was the basis by this Native American Women's Health Education Resource Center being denied a zoning permit. So in this case, racial hatred became adopted by the state as such, but this hate codified by the state became invisible when racial terror is focused on hate groups or hate crimes. Or could we perhaps understand South Dakota as itself a hate group? Okay. So with that then, the question becomes, how do we address racial and gender terror if we simultaneously recognize that the state also hates us and has no interest in protecting us from hate? If we recognize that genocide has in fact been the law of the land, instead of arguing that gender race crimes should be against the law, should not our organizing also be against the law? So this leads to my questions then that I'm thinking about. One is when we talk about organizing against violence outside the prison industrial complex, we see a developing movement around community accountability, but a lot of that community accountability focuses on often violence within our communities where we actually know the person, right? But what do we do around hate crimes? How would community accountability work in this section? And we are seeing emerging work from that, particularly from groups like the Audre Lorde Project, etc., that have been questioning the move within the LGBT movement to make hate crimes against queer communities as a hate crime, but are also looking at what are the alternatives for addressing hate crimes against queer communities of color in particular. The other thing that seems to come up is how might this intersect with the growing critique within Native studies around the politics of recognition. And here again I think of Glenn Coulthard's work, who is making an internal critique around the politics of decolonization within Native studies and Native communities. Because on the one hand we often see the critique in Native studies that we don't want to work with ethnic studies, we don't want to join racial justice groups because we are not racial minorities, we are colonized nations, and that's a completely different situation. While not dismissing this, however, if we ask ourselves what is decolonization, decolonization is not just thinking, like about turtles and circles, right? It's about actually dismantling settler states and dismantling capitalism and the structures that we live under. And that, of course, is a rather big job. So that would require us to actually work with lots of people so that we can actually do this. But interestingly, what happens is that rather than looking at decolonization as a political movement, which is about building mass movements that can actually challenge this society, the state guides us into articulating this as a legal issue, where we will have our claims as Native people recognized by the settler state. We will have our legal claims, our political claims, our cultural claims recognized by the state. Then ironically, in doing so, we actually position ourselves as racial minorities who are going to have their claims recognized in competition with other people also seeking claims. So we will no longer work with them, but in fact we will be in competition with them and not be in a position to build mass movements for social change. And then, of course, ironically then, in framing it as a legal issue, that whole framework depends on the continuation of the settler state that will recognize our claims. And we are then not in a position to think outside the settler state in terms of building a global movement to change the form of governance under which we currently live. And then, of course, I think when we have an intersectional analysis then, and we try to think beyond the politics of recognition, we then start to see that the whole framework that we are living under, the settler state, is itself also a heteropatriarchal construction, right, in which just as men are supposed to naturally rule women on the basis of biology, so too should the elites of the society naturally rule everyone else. And so this is why it becomes important to have an indigenous feminist critique to say that we must question kind of the way we have naturalized social hierarchy, not just in the larger society, but in our own social justice, racial justice, and sovereignty struggles as well. So with that, then, I think I will close from a quote from Sandy Grand, who kind of puts on the table, but now I've lost my page, so this will take a second. Oh, here we go. And the question I think that she's asking is, when we think about hate crimes or the politics of recognition, what would it mean to do so by centering Native peoples? Because when we do that, we realize that the genocide of Native peoples is foundational to the creation of the U.S. itself. The U.S. would not exist without both the past and continuing genocide of Native peoples. It is not a mistake or aberration to U.S. democracy. It is foundational to it. She says, quote, "The United States is a nation defined by its original sin, the genocide of American Indians. American Indian tribes are viewed as an inherent threat to the nation, poised to expose the great the great lies of U.S. democracy, that we are a nation of laws and not random power, that we are guided by reason and not faith, that we are governed by representation and not executive order, and finally that we stand as a self-determined citizenry and not a kingdom of blood or aristocracy. From the perspective of American Indians, democracy has been wielded with impunity as the first and most virulent weapon of mass destruction." And then finally, I just wanted to say, though, I think at the same time, and this was kind of informative to me, I was in Canada, where on the one hand we have a movement here around boarding schools in the U.S. seeking justice for survivors of boarding schools, and I was able to meet with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. And on the one hand, there's a big debate around that. Diane Million, Audra Simpson, and many people have made a critique of this movement in Canada, arguing that what has happened with the residential survivor movement is that the issue of residential schools is no longer a politics of genocide, but instead Native peoples have become articulated as a wound that need healing. So essentially, the policy of genocide has been psychologized such that the movement ends up becoming safe for settler colonialism rather than a challenge to it. And so then we seek reparations for abuses in residential schools rather than seeing residential schools as themselves abuse. Right? So similarly, we could also say with the move around reparation or hate crimes recognition, we start to look for reparations for racial incidences rather than seeing the state itself as white supremacist, that the state itself is the hate crime, right? But then at the same time, looking in the U.S. context where we don't even have that much, right, where like there's just no vocabulary around the abuses of boarding schools, how do we even get it to the point where it becomes a movement? And does that legal recognition provide a possibility for at least the vocabulary developing to say, you know what, the reason why our communities are messed up is not because we're dysfunctional, but is the continuing effect of human rights violations perpetrated by the state. So I guess the question that I'm wondering, is there a way to rethink the relationship between political struggle and legal struggle such that perhaps it can be a way to bring an issue out in the open without at the same time co-opting that political struggle so that we become focused solely on legal remedies and not on building a mass movement for social change. So thank you very much.
Great, as usual. And I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference and Andrea Smith for putting together this panel. Thank you for being here. I'm going to take a little longer than everybody else to present my paper, and I'm not going to even present the whole thing. So I hope you'll bear with me, and it makes sense even if it's not fully presented. The title of the paper is the Racial Ordering Thesis, the Problem of the Human and the Utilitarian Critique of Rights. What's new in the recently assembled global apparatus for administration of justice? Well, what's new is that humanity now has more than mere rhetorical force, for it seems to authorize military intervention in the territory of any nation state. From a critical stance that remains within the larger terrain of historical materialism, this paper reflects on the political symbolic context of deployment of the global legal apparatus in light of the post-Second World War ascension of cultural difference to the core of the global ethical juridical text. The beginning of this argument is built in this paper on comments on a moral condemnation and legal prosecution of deployments of state violence against its citizens. And basically my goal here is to highlight the specific force of what I call raciality. But my long-term interest is to open up an approach, which I only outline here, to the combined effects of categories such as gender, ethnicity, and class, which is captured by the concept of intersectionality, but an approach that attends to the specific ways through which the racial as a global, not a social signifier of difference, does its particular work of power at the level of representation, as in the moment of interpretation of certain events and justification. And also as the moment which our students at UCSD, to which our students at UC San Diego responded very well, brilliantly, in the university legal context, the moment of racial violence. Obviously, I can only give you a rough outline of this project. So I'll begin with a discussion of a few deployments of what I'm calling the racial othering thesis in critical analysis of human rights and international criminal law. More specifically, I'm interested in how these critiques engage the notion of humanity in forming these legal instruments. Then I move to a brief description of two instances to indicate how legal constructions of state violence in human rights and international criminal law require that we move beyond reading state violence as another modality of discrimination, of legal exclusion. If I have time, and I know I won't, but let me know what I would have done if I had time, I'll close this short paper with an outline of a version of what I call the utilitarian critique of ideology, which informs the racial othering thesis, which is the thesis that sustains our critique of rights to indicate why critical legal scholarship needs to spend some time with the examination of the political, symbolic, the ideological, cultural tools that produce the legal moral subjects, the global racial subaltern states and collectives now enclosed by the global juridical architecture. In the global present, it seems, humanity challenges a dear concept of political theorizing, the figure of sovereignty itself, which defines the modern state. I say it seems because we know there are states and states. Post-colonial polities found in Latin America, the Caribbean, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific are not equal players in the global stage. Though some of these have been part of the League of the Nations and now they constitute the majority member states of the UN, the Euro-North American compound has consistently retained control of these and other multilateral bodies. Now, critics of the global legal architecture, human rights, and international criminal law attribute this to the fact that the representations that justified colonial domination, constructions of European racial superiority, still guide the distinctions between the states that are charged with humanitarian crimes and those who control the global juridical structures, such as the UN Security Council, the International Criminal Court, the ones who lead the forces of humanitarian interventions, and house international human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. While I agree with the overall critique, I find it problematic how these interventions reproduce the same symbolic closure humanity enables. So let me explain. Instead of a critique of the very notion of humanity sustaining the Euro-American global political power, they defend it from ideological misappropriations. They condemn these, these ideological misappropriations of these global ethical guides. For the most part, these critics stop at the argument that representations of European cultural superiority now justify global domination. Much of the critical work in these instances, then, is the exposure of signifiers and statements on non-European inferiority and European superiority. So while not central theme of this central theme of his book, Dudenay's critique, for instance, cites the racial othering thesis when he discusses human rights and humanitarian intervention. I quote, "We," he claims, "try to silence the terror of the inhuman things within us by turning it into a question of morality. To become fully human, to become whole, our inhuman part is wholly projected onto the other." End quote. So for Dudenay, for instance, the category of crime against humanity signifies precisely that split. And then he goes on talking about human rights ethics. He says it's used to legitimize what the West already possesses. End quote. Now, do not expect that Dudenay is calling for a dismissal of the humanitarian and the human. For him, I quote, "Radical humanitarianism aims to confront the existent with a transcendence found in history, to make the human instantly told that suffering is humanity's inescapable destiny, more than human. We may need to sidestep rights in favor of right." End quote. In short, Dudenay repeats the known writing of racial difference as an ideological device which works through projection of undesirable traits onto the non-European other. Also deploying the racial othering thesis, Mutua's analysis of the savage victim-savior metaphor that governs human rights text and practice advances a critique which takes cultural difference as a given, an unproblematic descriptor of global existence, which unfortunately in the global present remains inflected by colonial hierarchies. At work in the global present, he argues, is a distinction between good and evil cultures. Liberalism refigured in human rights and democratic forms is the dominant political ideology. And global domination is marked by, I quote, "the imposition of the current dogma of human rights on non-European societies, which contradicts conceptions of human dignity and rejects the contributions of the other culture in efforts to create a universal corpus of human rights." End quote. An alternative, better measure of human dignity, he argues, I quote, "would respect cultural pluralism as a basis for finding common universality on some issues," end quote. This is the goal of his article, which he defines as, quote again, "a plea for a genuine cross-contamination of cultures to create a new multicultural human rights corpus." The human rights movement, he advises, should rethink and reorient its hierarchical binary view of the world in which the West leads the way and the rest of the globe follows, end quote. A ruse of the unconscious or an articulation of Western arrogance, racial othering here as an ideological strategy precludes articulations of the proper political moral subject, humanity. So what I find troubling is how humanity itself resists these critical challenges. But let me move to the other example to give you a sense of what I'm trying to get at, what I think the trouble is. In a report released late last year, Resistance Killings, Human Rights Watch charges Rio de Janeiro's and São Paulo's police for excessive use of lethal force in their actions against drug gangs. The report finds that, I quote, "the officers involved in these killings have reported the shootings as legitimate acts of self-defense, claiming they shot only in response to gunfire from criminal suspects. Given that police officers in both states do often face real threats of violence from gang members, many of these resistance killings are likely the result of the use of legitimate force by the police. Many others, however, are clearly not. The numbers alone are alarming." End quote. So for Human Rights Watch, then, the best way to curb these unlawful police killings, I quote, is to ensure that the officers who commit them are brought to justice. The obstacles that currently prevent or discourage prosecutors from doing so are serious but not unsurmountable. The key to ending chronic police impunity and thereby deterring future abuses is to ensure that prosecutors need no longer rely so heavily on police investigators to resolve this case. End quote. So for Human Rights Watch, the solution for police killing in Brazil is more law enforcement and better adjudication. So finally, and I'm quoting again the report, Human Rights Watch believes that it is crucial for Brazil's elected leaders to publicly support the prosecutors' efforts to ensure full accountability for police officers who commit abuses. Moreover, they should publicly challenge the misperception that human rights and public security are conflicting priorities. So despite the HRW good intentions, I'm convinced that unless there is a complete rewriting of the human rights text, such mass killings will never be legally addressed, because they are inscribed in a social context in which drug trafficking is comprehended solely as criminal practice, one stripped from any political significance, because it is seen as just an enactment of economically dispossessed black and brown populations' unique racial moral attributes. So what I want to highlight here is that moral statement itself. The report from the outset acknowledges the legitimacy of these killings, even though there isn't much to do in order to distinguish them, right, the legitimate from the illegitimate. As a moral statement, the charge against this excess in law enforcement then necessarily fails to address the social context within which these killings take place. Now, the question is whether it's possible or even desirable to bring this moral text and the juridical architecture it sustains into a crisis by rendering it accountable for that which is an effect of global economic and symbolic procedures of power. And I'm saying that because I want to invite us to consider moving our critique of the law, including the non-binding human rights instrument, which are now the global moral meter, beyond the demand for recognition, for inclusion, for protection from the state or some sort of global juridical figure. Which, here I would include the demand that when the state kills us, some of us, it does so within the limits of the law. Or put differently, the demand that when the police kill young and old black males and females in Brazil's favelas, for instance, it does so legitimately only when they are, in fact, resisting criminals. I don't know about you, but I'm not willing to make that demand. So more to the point, I don't think the charge against the Brazilian police will ever move beyond moral condemnation. Why? Because unlike, for instance, the case of Rwanda, Brazil public officials, unlike the case of Rwanda, Brazil's public officials will never be prosecuted for the killings of its black citizens. So I moved to Rwanda to kind of situate better this statement. So what are the conditions under which humanity becomes a powerful weapon in the global juridical arsenal? For the positivist separation of law and morality has troubled the core of international law, only a few events, the war-related mass killings in Nazi Germany, Japan, and the former Yugoslavia, have yielded calls for justice in the name of humanity that quieted states' claims for sovereignty and opened the way for the criminal prosecution of their representatives in international military interventions in their territories. After Rwanda, however, humanity's ethical authority alone threatens to dissolve both the juridical and ethical boundaries of the nation-state, potentially supporting unqualified international intervention in domestic affairs. How did the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda craft a legal statement that renders international law both desirable and necessary? And here I think the legal scholars can appreciate the irony. The answer to this question resides in how the case against the prosecuted Rwandan officials deployed cultural difference to consolidate humanity as the global ethical figure. That is, as an ethical signifier that comprehends Rwandans as pathological members of the human family. Well, how? The definitive move that allowed culture as custom to enter the domain of reason as law was to render mental contents acceptable objects of legal scrutiny. This happens in two moves that mark the ICTR adjustments of international law and its particular inscription of humanity in the global juridical architecture. First, the inclusion of subjective intent, with which, against their better positivist judgment, the prosecutor and the chamber entered the murky terrain of interiority usually avoided in municipal criminal cases. That is, the burden of proving what was in the perpetrator's mind. Second, the positivist bind of the law and the state-hunt international law disappears in another specificity of the ICTR statute, namely the inclusion of discriminatory grounds in the definition of crimes against humanity, when genocide already refers to group discrimination. What this distinction between groups and grounds enables, I submit, is the possibility of dissolving the burden of proving intent into the diffuse but anthropological notion of cultural collective grounds. In short, the ICTR chamber links actions to meanings in order to provide an objective explanation for the mass killings in Rwanda. How much time do I have? So let's look at one of the cases, which was the first one prosecuted by the criminal. It was the case of Jean Paul Akayesu. He was found guilty of 9 counts, 1 of genocide, 7 of crimes against humanity, which includes rape, and 1 of direct and public incitement to commit genocide. The difficult issue before the chamber when they were prosecuting Akayesu was the fact, or in the whole ICTR, is the fact that the Tutsi population does not fit any of the genocide classificatory terms, namely a national, ethnic, or racial group. They lack their own language or a distinct culture from the rest of the Rwandan population. Hence, when describing its factual findings, the chamber relies on signifiers of Rwanda's cultural specificity. For instance, the expert witness Alison DeForge, historian and Human Rights Watch activist, states that in post-colonial Rwanda's self-representation, ethnic distinctions, which were instituted by the Belgians, constitute an absolute reality and the objective context of Akayesu's actions. So that statement then checks arguments based on the contingency which is proper to historical, the colonial origins and post-colonial usage of the distinction between Tutsi and Hutu, and subjective, identity as a matter of self-representation process. Basing its findings on witnesses' account of customary rules in Rwanda governing determination of ethnic group, which follow the patrilineal lines of heredity, the chamber concludes that the identification, and I'm quoting, the identification of persons as belonging to the group of Hutu or Tutsi or Twa has thus become embedded in Rwanda's culture. So what culture does in this context? The chamber's use of an anthropological construction of Rwanda's cultural particularity depoliticized the killings of contenders for state control, thus rendering them a crime. And it does so because it conveys the cultural difference there, indexed by the notion of custom, conveys a kind of formal universality that rewrites contingent, elusive representations which are born out of historical trajectories. And when doing so, it produced the kind of objective reality that it is demanded by the juridical text. What renders these international crimes and the juridical architecture is in place to adjudge them powerful weapons of global subjugation is the fact that the tools of raciality, signifiers of racial and cultural difference, such as custom, provide a formal, universalizing account that features the ethical figure of humanity very core by instituting a descriptive rendering of humanity in human diversity and a prescriptive rendering of humanity, respect for human dignity. In the Akayesu case, it happens when, on the one hand, the judgment writes Rwandans as a whole as members of the human community, self-representing cultural subjects, while on the other hand, it also criminalizes Rwandans as a whole by attributing the existence of ethnic distinction to fixed moral attributes, absolute reality. But beyond depoliticizing this instance of political violence, As Mandani shows, there's argument that he develops in his When Victims Become Killers. Beyond depoliticizing this instance by arguing that it is an effect of colonial domination has become an absolute cultural reality, the Chamber findings have another political effect. For cultural difference produces a legal subject which, though part of, cannot actualize humanity, because its cultural particularity refigures a prior moment of human history. They have not and will never enjoy the gifts of which are rationality and freedom, the gifts universal reason has bestowed to post-Enlightenment Euro-America. Renaming post-colonial political violence as culturally determined collective crimes allows the removal of the already thin mantle of sovereignty from certain post-colonial polities. Global juridic architectures and procedures, international... Ooh, okay. I need water. Global juridical architectures and procedures sees these political events as examples of the state's failure to fulfill its ethical mandate and its protective role, protecting its population. Naming post-colonial massacres, genocide, or crimes against humanity preempt reading the state involvement as an exercise of self-preservation, as in the case of Brazil, when the police kill for self-preservation, the legitimate killings. For group membership or discriminatory grounds immediately signifies a loss of legitimacy or a loss of the state's capacity as the formal universal embodiment of its citizens' wills. Consistently, this undermining of the post-colonial state's ethical claims is a political symbolic weapon that can only be justified in the name of the protection of an entity, humanity, the ethical figure that prefigures the moral bond embodied in the composite nation-state. In sum, raciality through cultural difference works here not by writing Rwandans as non-human or less than human, as the racial ordering thesis suggests. Rather, it works by producing a body politic that fails to actualize universality because it lacks self-determination. Now, we can better appreciate Human Rights Watch calls for better policing of Brazil's economically dispossessed territories. While it would not take much theoretical sophistication to show how the victims of recent resistance killings in Brazil are black and brown males and females, HRW does not even contemplate a call for the prosecution of the Brazilian authorities under the crime against humanity. Why? I offer you two brief versions of answers that I have elaborated, somewhere else. First, Brazil is a settler post-colonial polity, one fully incorporated, even if in the margins of the Euro-American compound. Second, economic dispossession functions in the Brazilian national text as the sociological explanation for racial subjugation, which renders those with obvious markers of Africanness, blackness, pathological social beings. But the Brazilian state, as represented in the Brazilian subject itself, though precariously as it is, thrives in enlightened self-determination. So since I'm not going to read the end of it, let me just say where I take it in the last part of the paper. So going back to what it is the critique, to my analysis on the utilitarian critique of ideology and its relationship to the racial ordering thesis, my point there is to make a call for an analysis of power, an analysis that takes into account how racial power operates when in the very moment of production of persons, collectives, and states, such as Brazil and Rwanda, and not only when it is deployed later to advance the interests of a particular state. If anything, I believe that this analysis of racial power would enable us to advance a more nuanced and hopefully effective, because necessary, critique of rights, human rights or civil rights for that matter. Thank you.
Would like to thank the panel. That was a wonderful, wonderful papers. And I wrote a few notes, but I think we might be better served to take questions and answers, given that we have roughly about 10 minutes for those. So any questions?
First, I'd like to thank the panelists. This has been an excellent panel. I'm a social epidemiologist, so I'm a little out of my bailiwick here. So I just wanted to give you that as a background to my questions, so in case I ask questions that just make like no sense. But what I am struck by, both at this presentation and the presentations we've had thus far in the plenaries, is that I try to bring intersectionality into my work, and I done work on primarily quantitative research, which you critique quite rightly, I think, but quantitative research on addressing violence against women who have been marginalized in various ways, including incarcerated women, and I've done also work on Native American women in the States, although I'm currently now in Canada. So it seems that intersectionality can be brought to bear in kind of where I see kind of three places, and I'm seeing the issue as one of the analysis of the problem and then the strategies to address whatever we label as the problem, right? So first there's kind of what are the causes, or first labeling who is oppressed, right? So there's the issue of the words we use and how we decide who we're going to talk about is oppressed. And so many of the speakers have addressed, including you all, in terms of how we're labeling groups, right? So are we talking about Native American women, or are we talking about Native American men, or are we talking about men, or are we talking about women, or, right? So there's the categories. Then there's the issue of once that labeling is, of course, then related to what are the causes of those inequalities. And then there's the issue of what are the best strategies for addressing the inequalities that get named. So, but in thinking through the strategies, there have been many critiques of the strategies of different movements or different groups and how they get co-opted. But it seems to me that the state or the powerful are going to use one of two means, and have, since forever, used one of kind of two means to repress the groups who are trying to fight for the rights. So they're either going to co-opt the messages, which seem to be more common in the last century or so, right? They're going to do all kinds of means of co-opting, whether those come from attempts to try to get at structural solutions, which, you know, I'm assuming that the people who are trying to reform law are trying to get at some form of a structural solution, short of outright revolution and overthrowing of the government. So they're trying, all of these are attempts at reform, right? So they're attempts to, but they're still attempting to change structure. So whether you're doing that or you're doing other things, people are, so I'm sorry, whether they're coming from there or they're coming from the community, they can get co-opted, it seems to me, no matter whether it's mass movement or whether it's trying to reform state law. They have all, we can come up with numerous examples through decades where they've all gotten co-opted by the state. Or the state, when they're more effective, the state just does outright oppression. The state murders people, they pit people against one another, you know, the whole COINTELPRO, or, I mean, just the whole history. So, I mean, the state will always, the powerful will always fight to maintain its power. And it's going to either do it outright or it's going to co-opt. So how do we, I think it's valuable to critique the ways in which it's been co-opted, but I guess my question is, how do we decide at any given point in time what strategy is the best strategy to take?
Okay. That's so much that this is going to take an hour to respond to. But, I mean, because it's, I think you're bringing up so many great issues that don't really have a clear answer. But I just want to say a couple things. When we talk about who is oppressed, I think when we think of intersectionality, we have to go beyond. Intersectionality is constellated in just an identity and about the intersecting logics of domination because they structure the world for everybody. So for instance, when we look at settler colonialism, that obviously oppresses Native peoples, but it actually oppresses everybody because I think what's going on with settler colonialism in terms of Native genocide is destroying an alternative forms of governance, right? Because when we look at the history of colonization in the Americas, this was an issue around maintaining the naturalization of domination within white societies that couldn't stay as such if the alternative of Native communities continued to exist. Because for one thing, many white women were saying, hey, I think we can get a better deal over here, right? So domination only persists if it seems natural. So I think of settler colonialism is also about erasing the alternative, not just for Native peoples, but for everybody. Erasing the alternative that we could all live differently in a way that's not as oppressive. So these logics screw over everybody. I think we have to look at the intersecting logics and not just about, and get away from oppressed people are better than other people because this is what gets us onto the competition to be quadruply oppressed. And so that we get like some special prize at the end of the day and we're fighting to see who's more oppressed rather than saying, hey, we're all set to be complicit in everybody's oppression. How can we develop a coalitional project to undo these logics? Okay, then, but I'm not arguing for the postmodern non-identity politics, just to be clear about that. Okay, so then the other thing, in terms of the co-optation, I think that this is where I think what we see going on now is getting out of the kind of the vanguard elitist model or the nonprofit industrial model, which presumes there's certain people who know how to end global oppression better than everybody else, and recognize that if we actually knew how to end it, we would have done it by now, so let's be a little more humble and try the whole revolution through trial and error. And as you're saying, yes, any great thing we do today will get co-opted tomorrow, so that's why we need a better strategy the day after. We need a more jazzy approach, and also to recognize that colonialism has shaped our political imagination itself, that we really can't even imagine what a non-oppressive world would look like, right? So part of our project is starting to imagine the unimaginable. That's why we need to, I think, integrate arts, culture, and expand what the political project even is, right? So therefore, I don't think we need to necessarily get depressed because we are actually in the 18-year plan to end global oppression, and we only have 12 more years to go, so we should cheer up about this situation. It's going to be starting in Riverside anyway at our conference. But anyway. But nevertheless, I think maybe if we just, instead of feeling we have to have the solution, rather think of ourselves as part of a collective imaginary project that future generations will take up from us.
Oh, can I just say that our moderator is someone I roped in at the last minute. His name is Damian Schneider. He's a postdoc at Santa Barbara in Black Studies.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, maybe two.
Well, we have one more question.
One more question?
From Dean.
All right.
I don't want to hold anyone over. And it's like really incoherent, so I'm sorry. I guess I was interested in your critique of empirical research, and to me it links to what Andy was just saying about alternative forms of governance, but I think it links to everything that I heard, which was really amazing, and I'm so grateful to all of you for your work in many ways. But I guess, so just to be super local, here at UCLA there's a pretty significant project around gathering empirical data about mostly white gay people, but sometimes also other gay people, to forward, and some very occasionally trans people, to forward various projects that we could critique all day, like hate crimes laws and anti-discrimination laws and marriage and stuff. And there's all kinds of problems with that, and that we could say for the sort of policy targets, but I'm interested in how the problems are also about the actual methods, the empirical methods, and how to have a conversation about that part. And I think that I'm partly interested in it because I also see us engaging in the more racial justice-centered, economic justice-centered, queer and trans politics that I see myself as part of. We also engage in empirical projects. We also do needs assessments. And we have critiques of categories that we use to gather empirical data. And so we do different ones and we let people fill stuff in. But it's still, I think I still have some, and that work is very essential and I use it, but I still have some questions about how gathering standardized data is related to stateness and to like the history of racial science and to other state forms that have been essential around race categorization, especially in the United States, as a technique of land theft and other things, and other projects. And so I guess I'm like, I really want to hear people who I think are as wonderful and smart as you guys talk to me more about other, I don't know, just sort of how to talk more about what's really concerning me about the empirical turn. I think it's happening in law, it's happening everywhere. And it's related to me to the administrative state as a body of expertise, and sort of that basis in the history of the development of the American administrative state. So I don't know, I just wanted to ask.
I mean, just as a quick response, I mean, I can think of one example that I always sort of return to, which is the legal organization Justice Now, which they primarily are engaged in offering legal services to women prisoners in California. But the thing about the legal process, which I actually think is really great about it, but then that gets virtually little attention and sort of encouragement in the ways that the profession is taught, but also in the ways that we study it and learn from its history, is that it's very sort of, it's vociferous. It has lots of different texts and voices, and I think that we can point to certain attorneys and Justice Now in particular that is use that, all of that sort of language that it gathers in the process of legal service, and make sure that it ends up in other spaces that are not the typical spaces that we would expect. And I'm not really saying that that's sort of like the answer or the solution, but I'm just saying that I think that it took a certain amount of creativity on the part of these lawyers who sort of saw the law as this space in which you're contesting fantasies and images and imaginaries, and actually deprioritizing the imperative to win, right? And I think that even the sort of explicit sort of commitment about legal services engaging in culture and the production of culture makes a huge difference in the way that the categories are used. And so I would just sort of gesture towards that. But I do think that, and Denise and I were just talking about this space in places like this to actually have workshops where we can collectively think of what to do with all of this knowledge that we have, so that it doesn't end up in reports and legal briefs and in a courtroom. I mean, that's all fine, and I'm not saying don't stop that, but I'm saying let's do more of that outside of these formal channels in an organized way.
Yeah, actually I have a question. So is the gathering of empirical evidence to what end? Why is it gathered? And number one, and then number two, I think we also need to pay attention to, which is what I try to do in the paper, separating racial difference from other social categories, is what is it that evidence is telling us about power? And the question is, then it raises the questions of whether or not the legal context, that moment is where you will engage. It might be that, for instance, bringing cultural difference to cases, and folks who study cultural defense, they know how much is a trap, right? It's a trap because we end up always emphasizing the fact that the ones who are before the criminal court should be there anyway because of their trajectory. So I think we may need, really, I believe that we need to reconcile. If you look at political theory and legal theory, it's always about the law in the state, even as us and others try to push the state outside of that. And I think that movement from legal positivism was very smart, because we keep forgetting that it's not only always legal, it's always already political, because now these societies in which we live, they are produced by this compound, the law and the state. So sometimes the site of intervention might be the state, the ideological one, the cultural critique. And the law may not be, the legal space may not be the only one. So that's.
And I was going to recommend Denise DaSilva's book as an excellent discussion on this, as well as Ray Chow's book, The Protestant Ethnic, because this gets into the logics of the academic industrial complex and how it maintains the settler state, because what it does essentially is position Native people, people of color, et cetera, as ethnographic objects of truths to be revealed, right? So that's the whole basic study of this data, is reveal the truths that our bodies are supposed to embody, but we cannot ourselves be the adjudicators of truth itself. We cannot be the ones who do the theorizing. We cannot be the ones who do the analysis. And so we then get entrapped in thinking if people just knew the truth about us, we would be free, right? Rather than ourselves kind of questioning that whole framework. And in fact, when we do work that doesn't come from that position, and often it's just illegible to people within the academy. When I've done work in Native Studies, they go, there's not enough ethnographic detail. Right? There's no other way to position Native Studies as anything other than studying Indians. We can't think of Native Studies as itself its own methodologies or frameworks. I think we could apply this more broadly. So I think what you're putting on the table is a bigger epistemological framework from Western Enlightenment that we also have to put up to question.
Well, I think that does it. That was very, very good. I want to thank the panel again.